Hi, everyone. Welcome to Rafael at Home. My name's Sterling Heshpeth. I'm the programming manager for both the Docklands and the Mill Valley Film Festivals. And you have been watching Silk Road. And with us here today is the writer, director, Tiller Russell. Thanks for joining us, Tiller.
Thank you so much for having me, Sterling.
Congrats on the film. I guess we have to date this back to the 2014 Dead End on Silk Road Rolling Stone article, which is what the credit says this was based on. When did you first learn about this incident, and when did you decide you wanted to make it into a movie based on what you read in that article?
Well, it was interesting. I remember reading in the newspaper the day after Ross Ulbricht was arrested in the sci-fi section of the Glen Park Library in San Francisco. I remember opening the paper and sort of reading the headline the next day, and it was just the kind of shadowy initial top line reporting, mysterious guy named Dread Pirate Roberts, dark web, and there was very little that was actually known about it. But I remember having this kind of visceral instinct. There's a story there, there's a movie there. I don't know whether it's a doc or whether it's a feature film or where it will go, but I was really struck by it. And then I kind of, as somebody who goes back and forth following crime stories, both in sort of on the narrative front as well as in nonfiction, I kind of am always tracking what I think are the most potentially interesting, crime stories that are out there. And a couple of years later, or a year later maybe, what ended up happening was David Kushner, this brilliant journalist who has done a lot of fantastic stuff for Rolling Stone over the years, did this what I would consider a humanist portrait of Ross Ulbricht, and that was the Rolling Stone article that you referenced, and I was so kind of struck and taken with it because it seemed very relatable and accessible and human in a way that the story hadn't hitherto. And so that ended up becoming the kind of the basis and the springboard for the movie.
Great. And I think the legal struggle wasn't even done when the article was written. Was there any additional documentation afterwards that you were able to use, or other kind of follow-up interviews that you deployed for the film?
Well, it's a great question. What ended up happening is when that article was published, producers had optioned it, come to me. They were fans of, I think the 7.5 I had done at that point. And so they came to me, asked if I would be interested in adapting it. And they said, "What do you know about this?" And I was like, "Man, I know everything. I've been following this, moment to moment obsessively since it broke." And what was interesting is it was really only half the story that was in that article. None of the second half of the story, which was the malfeasance of the corrupt DEA agent and other law enforcement officials that were involved in trying to both bust as well as fleece Ross. And so, fortunately, I have kind of a source network from the nonfiction work over the years of people that will dial me into interesting stories. And so some folks I knew at DEA and the U.S. Attorney's Office tipped me and said, "Man, this is like, you haven't even heard the second half of the story. This is amazing." And so once I began to kind of have that as a structure in my mind of it being a two-hander, these two kind of opposing arcs of these characters, suddenly I had a framework to begin working from. And then, process-wise, initially I approached it in a similar fashion to what I would have done with a documentary. I read everything that had been published on the story. I talked to anybody that knew Ross. His ex-girlfriend, Julia V, who's portrayed by Alexandra Shipp in the movie, actually came on board as a consultant for the movie, kind of giving me an insight into Ross and what her relationship with him was like. And then there were all these what I consider sort of breadcrumbs that Ross had left in his trail. There were his public postings as Dread Pirate Roberts on the Silk Road website. There were the journal entries that he had written on his laptop over the course of it, which eventually was confiscated after his arrest. There were the chat logs with, between Dread Pirate Roberts and Knob, between Chronic Pain and Dread Pirate Roberts. So there was this vast kind of historical archive, so to speak, that gave access to Ross's voice. And I wanted to, my goal was to hopefully get as close as possible to that, to be, I guess, spiritually true to him, and kind of creating a portrait of it. So there was all that material to draw from. And yet there were also so many kind of contrasting and conflicting accounts of him. There was, Ross the Boy Scout, Ross the lover, Ross the bomb the system libertarian. And so for me, it was kind of a process of triangulating and mapping the different versions that he had broadcast or had been sort of the ones that he had personally broadcast or that others had painted of him, and kind of crafting what was, I guess, my personal portrait of him.
And you mentioned Alexandra Shipp. She and Nick Robinson, who plays Ross, they actually knew each other from Love, Simon, which they appeared in together. Tell us about how you went about casting both of them and what kind of rehearsal space you found in order to just really nurture the dynamic between them.
Well, it was, I met with almost every sort of hot up and coming young leading man in Hollywood, sitting there, in the initial, when I had written initial drafts of the script and began to kind of take meetings on it, and, this fascinating array of potential actors. But when I sat down with Nick Robinson, he had this, I guess, this vulnerability and this kind of sweetness and softness to him that made him very lovable, very relatable as a human. I just liked being in the room with him. And I thought, given that you're taking this character who's going to go from kind of initiating his journey with this naive idealism to kind of this dark road, so to speak, that the story would take him on, I knew I had to find somebody that audiences could hopefully emotionally connect with. And when I met Nick, I was like, that's my guy. And then it was really interesting, because Nick and Alex have a longstanding relationship from Love, Simon on forward and know each other very well, I knew that there would be inherently this organic intimacy that they could draw from, because oftentimes when you're shooting films, that are, I think really nowadays it's almost anything, but certainly something that's less than $20 million, $50 million, whatever the number is, you don't have a tremendous amount of rehearsal time and the ability to get people together. So being able to rely on a genuine, real, organic relationship that they could draw from on screen was a great sort of benefit. And I thought also, hopefully for audiences, it would be fun to see these two, who you remember from the like Love, Simon era, now blossomed into these sort of different older, wiser grown-up characters, and in a different kind of triangulated relationship.
And it's interesting because you use Julia essentially as the frame of reference, because we mostly see how Ross, the trajectory of his corruption by comparison with her, they become more and more alienated over time. Is that how you originally envisioned the relationship, or does that seem to be obvious the direction to take it?
Well, it was, I asked Julia, the real Julia V, what it was like. I was like, what was your relationship like? And she said, as soon as he locked on the idea of Silk Road and bringing this thing into the world, suddenly it was like being in a sort of weird menage a trois, where that ended up occupying more and more of his consciousness, his passion, his time, his energy. And she kind of felt increasingly locked out of it, and that struck me as authentic and real and relatable, but also kind of an interesting character arc where progressively he began to lock everybody out of his world, sort of by lies and deceit, and then by the amount of time he's spending. And so it provided a kind of arc of descent for him that I thought was very mappable that way.
And speaking of casting, we also have an interesting contrast between Jason Clarke, who our Mill Valley Film Festival attendees will know because he visited us a couple years ago, and Jimmy Simpson, who most people probably know from Westworld, because they're two sides of the same coin, where one is really young, really, really progressive, but also really overconfident, and the other is very old school, very, he's not ahead of the learning curve, but he also is very results oriented. Talk about casting both of them, as well as how you wanted to contrast the two characters.
Well, I've been such a fan of Jason Clarke for so long. You know, he's just such an amazing performer in everything he does. And so he was the first kind of major actor to sign on. And once he said, I want to do this, I see that guy, I know that guy, I can live that guy, I immediately sort of stopped looking around at any other possibility. And I was like, Jason, that's the guy. And then from there, it becomes a question of building it out in the most interesting way, because while it is fundamentally a two-hander, right? It's Ross's universe and Rick Bowden, the character played by Jason Clarke. There are these two characters that are on these opposing arcs, almost like they're missiles fired at right at one another. But then there's the interesting kind of cast of characters that orbit around both of them and whose lives are affected by them. And so it sort of, I ended up feeling very grateful that a wonderful ensemble cast sprung up around them. Jimmy Simpson is just so good and so professional and so delightedly directable. He's like, okay, dial me in, tell me exactly what you want, like spin the knobs, however you want. And it was like such a pleasure to collaborate with him and work with him. And then you had, Daryl Britt Gibson, who plays Rayford opposite Jason. You had Katie Azelton. And in some way, all of these people, Lexi Rabe from the Avengers, the young daughter, and so they became, a constellation of their half of the movie, right? Because in a way, it's almost as if, and we literally actually constructed it and shot it as if it was two separate movies. There was the Ross movie, the Nick Robinson, Alexandra Shipp movie, and then there was the Jason Clarke movie. And so it became about putting the most interesting people around each of them, whether that's, Paul Hauser, who's just, such a delight and a pleasure, everything he does from, Eastwood's Richard Jewell to Spike's latest. He's just such a, scene stealing character, on down the list of just Daniel David Stewart, who's a fantastic addition to the troika of Ross and Julia and, played by Nick and Alexandra. So I felt like I was at the poker table catching great cards one after another as these cast members sign on.
And the interesting about it, of course, is that it is not a trajectory of good versus evil with a final kind of climax confrontation, but ultimately it starts to entwine about the complicity of both of them, because Jason's character and Ross end up being more similar than they are different in terms of their intentions and their final goals and how they mean to achieve them.
Well, I think that's one of the things that drew me to the story in a fundamental way to begin with, because I always find that the people that are riven with internal conflicts, where the forces of light are warring against the forces of dark within them in some fundamental way. Well, it's less easy to say good guy, bad guy, protagonist, antagonist, anti-hero. What is this? It's harder to kind of get a beat on it. To me, it's really like that's where, in the gray area, is where the kind of most fascinating stuff often happens. And that was the thing I think about, the intention of the movie anyway, is it's these two guys who end up, isolating and locking out everybody that's around them progressively, such that by the end of it, it's finally only both of them that are kind of inside the same bubble together,
Mm-hmm. How long did it take to shoot the movie? And then how long did it take to cut it?
We ended up shooting the movie. I'm trying to remember the total number of shoot days. We shot the bulk of the movie in New Mexico, and then did kind of a movable feast with a smaller unit where we shot in San Francisco, shot in Austin, shot a little bit in Baltimore. So, about 30 days all in is, somewhere around there, is what we were looking at. And then the editorial on it probably took about a year, I would guess, or maybe a little bit less, but had a wonderful, team of people surrounding it. The editor, Greg O'Brien, who cut the report for Scott Z. Burns, among many other things. Super talented guy, and like a team of people with whom he has worked and collaborated over the years, kind of from, the Scott Burns, Soderbergh lineage. So I felt very lucky and grateful to be, plugged into, folks from that camp.
Now, that's obviously very different than your pretty substantial experience with docs, because docs usually shoot for a lot longer, you shoot a lot more. You don't know where the story's going. You just have to pivot at every moment. What are some of the challenges about um, doing a narrative film that makes it in some ways tougher than docs, even though docs can often be more of a marathon, and relatively speaking, narratives kind of have to be a little bit more like a sprint.
Well, I think in the most fundamental way, all of the writing happens on the narrative side of things before you go into principal photography, right? And I mean, I can't remember how many drafts of the script, 70 something drafts of the script were done, by the time we were actually shooting. And even still, once we had shot, I'm still fooling with the script, rewriting dialogue, voiceover and whatever else. So whereas in post, essentially what you're doing, in a doc is you're harvesting the material in production. And then, for lack of a better term, the writing process really is the editorial process. So it is much more protracted. So in that way, they're almost kind of inverse to each other, in a fundamental way. And yet at the same time, there's a certain amount of there's a lot of overlap and similarity. At the end of the day, storytelling is storytelling, and kind of 3-act structure, and I guess the symphony of people with whom you collaborate to get anything done is a constant on either side of it. But I have been fortunate both in the nonfiction space as well as in the narrative space to be surrounded by amazing groups of collaborators. So that's at the end of the day, there's this kind of people oftentimes think, well, it's the director that's doing everything. Really, to me, it's like, are you surrounding yourself with people who are better, smarter, sort of more thoughtful, more nuanced, and artful at what they do than you, and then kind of horse whispering to get the best out of everybody.
Now, in your research for the film, including the interviews that you did, was there ever one particular thread or one particular anecdote that you really liked, but no matter how much you tried, you couldn't quite find a place for it in the film? Were there any things that really stood out for you?
Well, one of the things that we realized soon after Greg O'Brien assembled that like editor's cut of the movie was we had a lot of movie. We'd shot kind of a 3-hour movie that had probably 4 or 5 additional full scenes for both the Ross half of the movie and the Bowden side of the movie. And it was this sprawling kind of epic thing. And so even though individually some of these scenes were fantastic and actually some of my favorite moments in certain instances, as it began to kind of like cook down and condense as things do progressively in the editorial process, we would have to make these agonizing decisions of, okay, in and of itself, this scene with Daryl Britt Gibson and Jason Clarke as they're, for example, turning the Bitcoin into cash money at the bank, which was this like laugh out loud hilarious scene, but it felt late in the movie, for example, to be playing the lightness of it, where both of them were kind of descending into the entropy of the end of the film. And so as much as we loved that scene, it ended up having to get dropped from the movie. And then there were early setup scenes that were for example, between Nick Robinson and Alex Shipp that were, beautiful scenes in their own right between the two of them. But we sort of felt as you're whipping between the two different stories, hopefully that provides a narrative drive as you're cutting from this, this half of it back to this half of it. And that's sort of propulsively moving you forward. And so that when a beat fulfilled the same function, even if the scene itself was great, we sort of felt like, okay, narratively, we've accomplished that and we need to be back in the other story now. So it was oftentimes more in post where we discovered that than in the, scripting or research stages.
Great. Now you're joining us from Colorado. What are your plans next in terms of a film or a TV project or something that you have percolating on the back burner?
Well, I am actually literally was just finishing up the screenplay adaptation of my documentary Operation Odessa, which will be my next movie, which I'm excited about. And then I've got a handful of doc projects that are in the offing, some very cool crime stuff. That's sort of my beat. But also some interesting music stuff has kind of come to light. So I hope to continue on both paths of the narrative work and the nonfiction work, and being able to toggle between the two, and sometimes translate and adapt. We're talking about adapting Night Stalker, which we've done for Netflix as a narrative series, for me to direct as well. So, lots of crime and chaos in the pipeline.
Well, we'll keep our eyes out for it. Tiller, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for sharing your film Silk Road with us. Have a great year and good luck with everything.
Thank you so much, Sterling. It's a pleasure being here, and you take care and stay safe.
Cheers.